Ciao friends, welcome to another video from SQL BI. In this video, we'll tell you how to make a bullet chart in Power BI. A bullet chart is something that can be really effective when you're trying to compare actual results to a target. This is really important when you want to make useful reports because you need to provide context so that people can interpret and use those numbers in an effective way. To understand this a little bit better, let's take a look at a report in Power BI. In visualization, when we talk about context, we're referring to additional information that helps people be able to interpret the data in our visuals. This is essential if we want to create useful reports. We need to provide this context so that people don't have to think too much about what they're looking at or rely on their implicit knowledge. To give an example, let's look at these charts here, a card and a bar chart that's showing the sales amount, where the bar chart is expressing it by product category. We can see that the sales are, for instance, 526,000, that computers is our highest performing category, our best performing category, but we can't really interpret these numbers. We can't say whether they're good or bad, whether the sales are high or low. We don't have the context to be able to make that interpretation. We would have to rely on our implicit experience, for example, in sales or looking at other information. Now, we could add this context by providing the target, for example, comparing to the previous year. We could switch to an adjacent bar chart, and then we could add the sales amount for the previous year, where this additional context can help us see that computers are performing quite poorly, whereas cell phones are actually performing quite well compared to last year. We could do the same thing for our card, switching to a KPI visual, where we add the sales amount for the previous year, and then in the trend axis, we could add the year. And we can see that the sales are in total 36% lower than they were the previous year. Now, this is much more useful than when we were just looking at the sales alone. But we don't have to just look at these absolute numbers if we're focused on the sales performance. Maybe we want to just zoom in on this difference. For example, we could look at the percentage difference between this year and the previous year of our sales, which helps us very quickly be able to identify which categories are performing the worst. This is much more useful than in the previous visual where we were just looking at our sales alone. However, when we're looking at the percentages, we still don't have the full context. We can see that TV and video is the worst performing category compared to its own category that previous year. However, we don't understand what the impact of this negative performance is on our total sales overall. To get that context, we would need to look at the difference in absolute values, where we can see that sales are lower by about 300,000 compared to the year before, and that actually TV and video is having a quite substantial impact, 84,000 in total. But home appliances is having our biggest drag on sales performance this year. So there's a lot of different information that we can provide when we need to give this context. And choosing what information to provide is really important to do. Sometimes different users need different information, so it's hard for us to make that choice. In order to help give that information, we could, for instance, use tooltips. So here, for example, we could add some fields to the tooltip wells down here, where we could add the sales amount of the previous year, and the sales amount in percentage, so that if a user wants to know, for example, what are the sales for home appliances, they can just hover and they see that information in the tooltip. However, there's a lot of limitations with tooltips. For example, we can't control how they are ordered here. And we also don't have the ability to set how these numbers are formatted specifically. So if we want to show them in thousands, or if there's a specific way that we want to convey that information. It's also just not very effective if someone wants to look at music, movies, and audiobooks and then compare that to home appliances. They can't rely on the tooltip to do that because they'll just be flipping back and forth, and that's just not very effective. In this case, a lot of people refer to an approach where they're using tables and matrices. Now, tables and matrices on their own are fine and they can be effective, but in these instances, often there's a temptation to just show all the information, all of the context. In this case, we're showing the sales amount of previous year, the difference in percent, and the absolute difference. This is showing the full picture, but it's also much less efficient than providing a visual approach. This also gets a lot more clustered if we want to, for example, add additional targets like 2 years prior, or the budget, or the forecast, which is something that's very, very common for people to do. So these kind of tables are really common in a lot of these reports, for example, comparing an actual to a target, because people want this full picture. Now, there's better ways to do this, a more visual way to do this, for example, using a bullet chart, which we'll talk about, but this isn't the only choice. We looked at 3 different ways to visualize this information, for example, using a bar chart, looking at the adjacent actuals and target, looking at a divergent chart with the percentages, and visualizing the absolute differences in a divergent chart. But we have a lot of other options that we can use as well. And choosing how we want to visualize this data is just as important as choosing what context we need to provide. Again, it really depends on your scenario, including the data, the question you're trying to answer, and your users and their preferences, or what they will find useful. Let's look at some of these examples and walk through when you might use them, what they look like, and what are some of the pros and cons. What we're now going to do is we're going to look at different ways that you can visualize actuals compared to a target when you're using a breakdown by category. For instance, product category, which we had seen in the Power BI report. We already looked at 3 different ways to do this, but we're going to look at quite a few more so that you can know what your options are other than the ones we showed and a bullet chart. Now, the first and simplest way that we could do this is by just using a bar chart and then setting some conditional formatting. For instance, in this bar chart, we could use conditional formatting to indicate that A is off target and that B is on target. Of course, we would need a legend to be able to show this to a user so that they know. However, this can be a nice and convenient way to just visually indicate whether something is achieving its target or not. Of course, we're missing the context of exactly by how much it's achieving the target, and if this absolute difference is important, then we could instead use a divergent bar chart that shows the absolute differences. As we talked about already, this is very useful when we're interested in the total impact that a specific difference is having. So if we want to know, is A off target, then how much is this difference really impacting our total sales performance, for instance, then this could be a really useful chart. This divergent bar chart is also really useful when we want to see what our top and bottom performers are. If we're interested in the relative performance, so for category A or category B compared to last year within itself, is it doing very well or is it doing very poorly? So we're not only interested in just the total impact, but more the relative impact within that category, then we might be more interested in the percentage difference. Of course, here we're then missing the context of this total impact. We would need to show those absolute numbers in order to get that. Now, we already saw these 3 different ways of visualizing this information, but let's look at some more. Another way that we could visualize percentages is using a progress bar chart. In this case, we're not looking at the achievement, but we're looking at how much of the target have we actually reached so far, where this is going to be 100%, the end of the bar. And we can see that very quickly looking at it, that we've achieved about 70% of our target because we have 20, 40, 60 based off of these blocks that are visible in the visual. So this can be a really good way of understanding how much more of the target do we have to go and how much have we achieved so far. This kind of progress is dependent on the kind of data that we have and the kind of target that we're trying to visualize. Situationally, it can be very useful, but when you're doing something like comparing sales to budget or the previous year, it might not be interesting, of course, because it's more difficult to visualize overachievement. Is not something that's really easy to see unless we really extend this axis, and it can get quite messy, particularly for categories that are overachieving by a significant margin. Now, We could also visualize this progress instead of in bars as a line. So this is largely just an aesthetic difference, but as we can see here, the colors are much less overwhelming. We're just focused on a more subtle difference, but the overall result is essentially the same. The main difference between this and the previous one is just that we're able to have a more subtle picture of the progress. And it has the same cons, that overachievement is going to be something that's a bit harder to visualize, but we might be able to, for example, instead of this dot, have an arrow that indicates that it's overachieving by a significant amount beyond that axis, for instance. But again, for our specific use case, this might not be the best chart choice. Instead, what we might use is a connected dot plot. And a connected dot plot is actually one of my favorite visuals. It's something I really like a lot because you get a lot of information in quite a compact space, much like the bullet chart. So with this, what we can see actually is that we have our target in gray. So this is our target, which could be, for example, the previous year. And we are then comparing it to our actuals. And we made a connected dot plot in the previous video where we talked about creating a timeline using SVG visuals. So if you're interested, you can always check that out. But what we can then do is we can use conditional formatting to quickly and visually show, are we on target or not? But then we can see the absolute difference, which is basically the difference between those two dots. So we get the context of what the actuals are, what the target is, and what the difference is between them. We don't get the percentage, but we can kind of visually see this just based off of the position of the dots. So a connected dot plot is a very interesting visual to keep in mind. It's a very good choice in addition to the bullet chart. It's definitely one that I would recommend for cases like this. Another choice is something that we also already did, the adjacent bar chart. So in this case, again, our target is the gray bars. So we're interested in seeing the target, but we're also interested in seeing our actuals. And we could use some formatting tricks to be able to do some conditional formatting to really quickly and visually identify that this category A is off target, whereas category B is on target. And here again, we're focused on the actual values of the actuals in the target. We're not actually showing and focusing on the difference, but we can visually see it based off of the length of the bars, the position of the bars. Now, if we want to make this a bit more subtle, what we could actually do is take the bars and we could overlap them so that it's easier for us to be able to see what that difference is since they're overlapping. So this is just a nice convenient way for us to be able to do that comparison. But it's essentially the same as using the adjacent bar chart. It's more of an aesthetic difference. It's just important to keep in mind that it can get a bit more visually busy and it can be a bit more difficult then to visually identify what are the actuals, what are the target, unless you make really good choices about your colors. An alternative to this is that we could fully overlap these bars and then make our actuals much smaller so that they are actually within the target. So our actuals are encompassed by the target, which is another way for us to make this a bit easier to visually identify what the difference is. However, we might want to just focus on that variance and plot the difference between them without having to sacrifice showing the actuals and showing the target in the visual. So this bar and bar approach can be interesting, but there can also be alternative approaches that might be better depending on what your use case is. So one example of this is if we do something called a bar and candlestick. So in this case, we basically just have our adjacent bars. So these are just adjacent, but we're actually adjacent. There we go. Spelling is hard. So what we're actually going to do here is we're then going to plot, and that's where the candlestick comes into play, is we're actually going to plot that variance so that we can actually see the variance in addition to the absolute values. So it's somewhat similar to the connected dot plot in that way, where we're looking at all three things. We're looking at our actuals, our target, and the difference between them. However, it's a bit more visually busy because the length of the bars takes up a lot more space rather than just showing this as, for instance, the two connected dots. This is also something that's quite difficult to make in Power BI, so the use cases might be quite limited, but this can still be an interesting approach for showing the actuals, the target, and the variance together. Now, what we could also do is we could just take our overlapping bars like we had seen previously, and then we could look at the variance, highlighting it here. So we're plotting our actuals as these black bars. So these are our actuals. And then we are visualizing our target. And we're looking at the variance between them, which is what's being conditionally formatted. So we can see that this is off target by that much, and this is on target by that much. So this can also be a more effective way, a more effective alternative than this bar and candlestick approach, because it's more concise, and it's also more easy to visually identify what the difference is between our actuals and our target. Now, we might want to show this variance in a completely separate chart. So in this case, we still have our overlapping bars, but then we have a completely new chart on top of it, which is showing the variance. This is something that's possible in Power BI, but it does require quite a few formatting tricks. But it's also a visual type that a lot of people, depending on their sector and their background, could be accustomed to. So it's really important to be aware of that, because if your users are already accustomed to seeing this, if they're familiar with this kind of chart type, then it might be something that's really useful to do. And we could even extend this farther by, in addition to having the absolute difference being plotted, we could add another chart to the right of it, which then shows the percentage. So just basically having a kind of small multiples approach where we're showing all three pieces of information: the actual values and the target values, the absolute difference, and the percentage difference. But again, this can get quite visually busy. So even though we're showing it in visuals, it might still have the same caveats as when we're using a table approach when the table is well formatted. So it's important to keep in mind that we don't overwhelm users with information. Now we come to the bullet charts. A bullet chart allows us to be able to visualize the target as well as the actuals, where the target is simply just a line, and we can quickly see the difference between them. So the variance here when it's negative, and then the variance when it's positive. And it's a more subtle way to be able to show the same information that we were looking at in the previous charts. Now, we could look at it like this, but we could also add some qualitative ranges. So what this basically means is that we could have some areas behind the bar which indicate different qualitative performance ranges. For example, this could be very bad, this could be satisfactory, this could be good, for instance, so that we're able to get some more sentiment based on the position of the bar. However, it's important to keep in mind that these ranges are not something that you can kind of just invent. It's important that you need to agree on this with users, that they even maybe provide these values. So if that information is available, or users are willing to collaborate with you in order to put that together, then this can be a really nice way to get a lot of meaning from this visual. However, it does make it a bit more visually busy because you're adding more stuff to the chart. Now, what we might also want to do is to take a more subtle approach, adding these dots basically for conditional formatting to indicate are we on or off target. And we could even add additional ones that are, for instance, even darker yellow if it's very off target, and a darker blue if it's performing very well, for instance. This is maybe a bad example. We could take a darker blue here. I guess I don't have one. So on. But we basically have the same thing where we have our actuals for the category, we have the target, and then we have a very subtle way to indicate whether we're on target or not using these action dots. And the purpose of these dots is to be able to draw attention to specific categories where action is warranted. So for instance, if we're very off target on a particular category, that's where we want to focus our attention. So we can spend less time looking at all the other categories, which might be, conditionally formatted in one of the previous options. We just want to focus on the ones where we take action. So if we know that, for instance, we're only going to be taking certain actions if the sales is 80% of the target or so on, then we could have this action dot here, this conditional formatting here, so that we can focus on that category and move on to take actions about it. Now, these are some of the different ways that we can use to visualize a comparison between actuals and targets, but we're going to focus on the bullet chart, and we're going to show you different ways to make a bullet chart in Power BI. So to walk through it again, a bullet chart consists of different parts where we're looking at our actuals, which is the bar here. We have a target, and then optionally, we might have these different qualitative ranges. So here, so these might be our ranges to indicate sentiment, like are we performing good or bad, for instance, depending on where the bar is landing. And we might also optionally have some labels. And in a nutshell, this is what a bullet chart looks like. And this is what we're going to be creating in Power BI. Now, you might be aware that in Power BI, a bullet chart is not a standard or core visual. So in order to create this bullet chart in Power BI, we need to actually make our own custom visual. If you recall from a previous video, there's 6 different ways that you can do this. You could create the custom visual by, for instance, MacGyvering the core visuals with the formatting options. You could add it from AppSource, from out-of-the-box custom visual. You could create it with SVG measures. You could use Deneb, or you could write it in code, Python, R, or JavaScript. We're going to look at the first 4 of these examples, and we're going to show you how you can do this for yourself, as well as providing the templates which you can find in the link in the description of this video. Let's take a look in Power BI as to how we can set this up. What we're now going to do is we're going to create 4 different bullet charts using 4 different approaches. The first approach, we're going to take the standard bar chart visual in Power BI, which you can just see here. So this is just the stacked column chart, I believe, or stacked bar chart. And we're just going to use some formatting options to make our bullet chart. Basically, all we need to do to make a simple bullet chart is just add the target lines. We don't have an option to add markers, and we don't have the option to add these lines in the default field wells, which you can see here, but we can MacGyver this by just using the formatting options in atypical ways. We can go to error bars, which is typically used to show variance or uncertainty in our data. And we can use this to actually add the marker. We do this by adding our target to the upper bound and the lower bound. So I drag sales amount previous year into the upper and lower bound, and then enable it, and we can see that the marker appears, but we just have to make sure that it is formatted appropriately, making it as large as possible and reducing the border to 0. Once we do this, then it's very easy to be able to compare our actuals to our target, but there are some caveats with this approach. For example, the labels are overlapping with this marker, and we're not able to very easily add these qualitative ranges. Instead, we might seek a different approach. We might want to use a custom visual from AppSource by selecting Get More Visuals if it's available in your tenant, so it needs to be enabled by your administrator, and then we can just search for bullet chart. Because it's such a popular visual, we have a number of options that we could choose. For example, we could choose this one by OKViz, OKViz being a part of SQL BI, so that you know. And once we select it, we can then read some more about the bullet chart and then add it to our report. You'll notice that there's an option here, plans and pricing, and this is important to be aware of. Some custom visuals are free, but some require you to pay to unlock for all the features, because of course, it takes a lot of effort for people to make these visuals so that you can easily use them. Let's just use the free version of the OKViz bullet chart and see how it works. I've already added this as a separate page, and you can see this bullet chart here. So this is one that's just made using the free version of the bullet chart, and it's similar to what we created in the core visuals with some additional options. We can add these qualitative ranges here, which we can include in this category here, states. So we have these additional field wells where we just have to add the states and it will add it to the visual. But we also have additional options like a comparison value, having multiple targets, a target for the variance, and so on and so forth. There's also a lot of additional formatting options that we can use. For instance, we have a formatting for our target line, we have the background of the bar, and so on. Now, if we had the paid version of this custom visual, we would get even more features, like, for example, visualizing the variance, using templates, or even improving the performance of the visual by incrementally loading it. And we could browse through examples of this by clicking through if you want to do this on your own time. But you can appreciate that this is also quite a simple approach. We just get the visual, we add it to our report, and then we can use it. But if custom visuals aren't enabled in your tenant, or if you don't have all of the options that you need here, for example, let's say we wanted to add action dots, then this might not be the best approach for us. When we need that additional flexibility, we really need to create the visual ourselves. One way that we could do this, if we do have access to custom visuals in AppSource, is we could use Deneb. Deneb is really interesting because it provides us a framework to be able to create our own visuals. For example, if I go here, we can see that this is a visual that I've created in Deneb that has a lot of additional options that I've added myself. For example, we have the data labels, these action dots to indicate things that are really performing well or poorly, and we even have a label above our target line. Deneb doesn't come with this visual out of the box, but we could add it from templates, for example, from the community or starting from the Vega or Vega Lite documentation. If you want to create your own visual in Deneb, you open its advanced editor, and I'll just zoom out here so you can see the full advanced editor, closing the panes. The advanced editor allows us to really define the specification for our visual. So we're writing a JSON-like syntax, and based on what we write in that syntax, we're telling Deneb how we want our visual to look. And in order to do this, we're actually going to be referencing fields in our data set. We're going to be referencing, for example, the product category and the sales amount. And these are just the fields that we've added in the values well of our visual. How this works is it is creating a table data set in Deneb, which we can actually see here. So this is the single table data set, and we're referencing the values in that data set to create our visual. So let's walk through a very simple example. We see that these labels are quite hard to read. They're very faint. So let's say I wanted to make these thicker, increase the font weight. I could do that here in the specification, but I could also do that in the configuration, which is just basically controlling more global formatting options for the visual by going down here. And we see that we have this text. We are currently using Sego UI Lite. We might want to change this to use Sego UI and then change the font weight to 800, which will make it thicker. Nothing happens yet because we have to click to apply the changes, or we could apply these changes automatically as we type. So I'll apply those changes, and you can see that now the labels have become thicker. So we could do this to add additional targets. We could do this to basically do anything we want that's supported by the Vega or Vega Lite syntax. And if you want help with this, because if this is something you've never done before, you could use community templates, the Vega and Vega Lite documentation, which are quite complete, or you could even use large language models like ChatGPT, which work quite well using this approach. So this is Deneb. As you can see and appreciate, this is a step up in complexity, but you are getting a lot more flexibility to be able to control the different parts of your visual. So this can be a good approach when you want to really have very specific changes to your bullet chart. For example, adding these action dots. But what if we wanted to just have a bullet chart inside of a table, or we wanted to have it in a card? If we want to do that, we might not want to create the entire visual ourselves. Instead, what we could do is we could create the custom visual in a SVG measure. And that basically looks like this. As you can appreciate, this looks very similar to what we did in Deneb, just there's less labels and it's more compact, but we basically just have a single column that has our visual, and it's just living inside of a standard table in Power BI. So this is just the normal table visual, and we've created a measure in this SVG measures, the bullet chart here, which is actually defining a SVG specification for our visual. And we went over how to do this and how this works in a previous video, so I won't go into too much detail here. But essentially, we're just defining the specification for the different vectors, and we're using some dynamic options in DAX to, for example, calculate the values of our actuals and target to determine their position, but also the conditional formatting, for instance. Now, you can appreciate that this is also quite a complex approach. And it's also really feels also like you're kind of MacGyvering the system. This is something that's, we're using this to create dynamic images, and that's not what it was originally intended for. So it's not like in Deneb that has all these features to support us and templates and so on. We can still use community resources or look at the documentation for SVG specification, but the possibility for creating errors here is a lot higher. So we need to realize that when we're creating our own visual in this way, we're going to spend more time not only building that visual, but also testing it. And this additional complexity can make our visual and our report harder to fix and maintain, not only by us in the future, but also other developers. So it's really important to understand the trade-off. Do we really want all of this flexibility and customization? Will it provide value for our end users? Will it be useful for them in exchange for dealing with this additional complexity? To summarize, what we've talked about is that it's important in your visualizations to provide context. Context is what makes your visuals and therefore your reports useful, and people need it to be able to interpret the information that they see. An example of providing context is providing a target, and you can use a number of different visuals to be able to compare actuals to a target, like a bullet chart. If you need to make a chart like this, like a bullet chart, you could use a number of different approaches, and the approach you choose depends on your specific needs, your skills, and the data and users that you have. We walked through 4 of these different approaches, and you can appreciate that each have their own pros and cons. It's important to keep in mind that simpler is often better, but you are going to have some trade-offs here between complexity and flexibility. As always, enjoy making reports. We'll tell you how to make bullet charts in Power BI, which is a very effective way to compare actuals to targets. This is a really nice way to be able to give context in your videos